The mansion stood tall at the edge of the city, its glass walls catching the sunlight and gleaming like treasure. Expensive cars lined the driveway, polished so brightly they could blind the eyes of anyone who passed by. Inside lived Mr. Harris, a millionaire known not only for his wealth, but also for his pride. He loved to show off. He loved to remind everyone that he was rich, powerful, and above them all. Every morning, Mr. Harris walked through his house in a tailored suit, even if he had nowhere important to go. His shoes shined like mirrors, his watch sparkled with diamonds, and his voice carried the heavy tone of someone who expected to be obeyed. The staff in the house moved quietly when he was around, their eyes lowered, their steps quick. They knew better than to anger him. He had made his fortune through business deals, buying and selling companies, and climbing his way up with sharp words and sharper strategies. He liked to tell people that he had built his empire from nothing, though the truth was that he had stepped on many along the way. But in his mind, he was proof of success. And he wore his arrogance like a crown. Whenever guests visited, Mr. Harris always found a way to boast. At dinners, he bragged about the price of his paintings, the speed of his cars, or the number of properties he owned. He treated conversation like a contest, always finding a way to make himself sound smarter, richer, more important. His guests often laughed politely, though many rolled their eyes in private. The staff, however, were not so lucky. They were always the target of his need to feel superior. He mocked the cook if a dish wasn't perfect. He scolded the driver if the car wasn't waiting at the exact second he stepped outside. And the maid, quiet, steady, always in the background, he hardly looked at her as a person. To him, she was simply part of the furniture. Invisible until he needed something cleaned. Mr. Harris believed education and intelligence belonged only to the wealthy. In his mind, poor people worked with their hands because they lacked brains. He never stopped to consider that hardship, not lack of talent, often decided a person's path. His pride had built a wall so high around his heart that he couldn't see beyond his own reflection. One evening, he hosted another lavish dinner. Important businessmen filled the long table, their plates decorated with meals most people could never afford. Laughter and the clinking of glasses echoed through the grand dining hall. Mr. Harris sat at the head, enjoying the attention as he shared stories of his travels, slipping in details of how much each trip had cost. His guests nodded, some amused, others silently annoyed. Behind him, the maid moved quietly, serving wine and clearing plates. She wore her plain uniform, her steps light, her face calm. She had worked in the house for months, always careful, always respectful, never speaking more than necessary. She listened without comment as the millionaire's words filled the air, his laughter ringing out after every boast. At one point, a guest asked him about foreign business deals. Mr. Harris grinned, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, languages? I know enough to get by. But really, who needs to learn them? That's what translators are for. People like me pay people like that." The table chuckled. Then his eyes flicked toward the maid, standing quietly with her tray. A spark of arrogance lit in his gaze. He smirked, deciding to turn her into the next piece of his show. He always enjoyed reminding his guests how far above his staff he stood. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, his voice loud enough to silence the room. "You see," he said, pointing a finger lazily in the maid's direction. "This is the difference between people like us and people like her. We build, we earn, we learn. They just serve." The words stung the air, heavy and cruel. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the maid with sympathy. She stood still, her eyes lowered, though a flicker of something unreadable passed across her face. Mr. Harris, however, noticed nothing. He leaned back, pleased with himself. Pride swelled in his chest as he soaked in the silence, believing he had made his point. He loved moments like this, moments where his wealth and status seemed untouchable, where others were forced to see him as the king of his world. But beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to form. His pride, his arrogance, his careless words, they were leading him straight toward the lesson he never expected. For now, though, he raised his glass, smiling smugly as if he had just proven a universal truth. To him, the night was another chance to shine, another chance to show his power. He didn't know that the very person he mocked would soon become the reason he froze in disbelief, the reason his pride would collapse in front of all. Asterisk. The maid everyone overlooked was named Clara. She moved through the grand mansion, like a shadow present in every room but rarely noticed. Her uniform was always neat, her steps careful, her voice soft. To most, she was just the maid, someone whose purpose began and ended with cleaning. But behind her quiet eyes lived a story far richer than anyone imagined. Clara had not grown up in luxury. Her childhood was marked by struggle, but it was also marked by determination. Her father had been a schoolteacher in a small town, and from him she learned the value of knowledge. He taught her to read by candlelight, encouraged her to memorize poems, and insisted that her mind was just as powerful as anyone's, no matter the color of her skin or the weight of her pocket. Clara excelled, learning quickly, hungry for every piece of information. By the time she was in her teens, Clara spoke two languages fluently and was studying a third. She dreamed of becoming a teacher, maybe even a professor, someone who would inspire others as her father had inspired her. But dreams often collided with reality. When tragedy struck her family in illness that drained their savings, Clara was forced to set aside her ambitions. She became the provider, taking jobs wherever she could. Education turned into a luxury she could no longer afford years later. When she found herself working in Mr. Harris's mansion, she did so with quiet acceptance. The world had not given her what she once sought, but she refused to let bitterness consume her. She still carried her dignity like a secret flame, burning steady in her heart. She cleaned with care, polished every corner, and treated everyone she served with respect. Even if respect was rarely given back to her, Mr. Harris, of course, never saw any of this. To him, Clara was invisible. He rarely bothered to learn her name, calling her maid or simply snapping his fingers when he wanted something done. Guests hardly noticed her at all, except when she poured their wine or cleared their plates. But Clara noticed everything. Her quiet eyes caught details others missed: the nervous tapping of a businessman's fingers, the false laughter of a guest pretending to enjoy Mr. Harris's bragging, the subtle sighs of staff who worked under pressure, though she rarely spoke. Clara carried herself with an inner strength that set her apart. When she walked into a room, her calm presence softened it. She never slouched, never dragged her feet. Her posture was upright, her movements graceful, as if even in her plain uniform she refused to surrender her pride. She was not wealthy, but she was not broken either. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the evening, Clara would sit by her small window in the servants' quarters and open an old book. The pages were worn, the cover faded, but the words inside still brought her comfort. She whispered sentences in different languages, practicing them under her breath so she wouldn't lose the skills she had worked so hard to gain. It was her secret, her way of keeping alive the part of herself that the world didn't see. What Clara understood, and what Mr. Harris never could, was that strength didn't always shout. Strength didn't always demand attention. Sometimes strength was in the silence, working with dignity when no one applauded, carrying knowledge when others assumed you had none, holding your head high even when someone tried to make you feel small. Guests occasionally noticed this quiet aura. A kind visitor might smile at her, saying, "You're very graceful, you know?" Clara would only nod politely, never revealing the depth of her mind. She wasn't seeking recognition. She had learned long ago that true worth doesn't depend on someone else's applause. Yet, under the surface, there was always a tension. She heard Mr. Harris's mocking words often, the way he belittled his staff, the way he assumed their silence meant ignorance. Clara never answered back, but each insult settled in her memory, not as pain, but as fuel. She knew that someday, arrogance always found its lesson. And though she didn't know when or how, she trusted that truth always surfaced. Clara wasn't bitter toward Mr. Harris, even when he overlooked her humanity. She pitied him. She saw his pride for what it was, a fragile wall built to hide his emptiness. And while he mocked others to feel tall, Clara understood that real strength was never about pushing people down. It was about rising even. When the world tried to hold you back, so she worked, day after day, with steady hands and a calm heart. She polished the millionaire's pride without letting it rub away her own. She lived with humility, but not with shame. Her silence was not weakness, was patience. And patience, she knew, could turn into power in the right moment. That moment was coming sooner than anyone expected. For now, Clara continued to clear the plates, refill the glasses, and quietly move in the background of Mr. Harris's grand dinners. But in her heart, she carried something priceless: knowledge, discipline, and a strength he could never take from her. And one evening, when Mr. Harris decided to mock her in front of his wealthy friends, Clara's quiet strength would finally step into the light, turning the room upside down and leaving him frozen in disbelief. The night glittered with wealth. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, silverware gleamed under the golden lights, and the long dining table was lined with crystal glasses filled with red wine that caught the glow like rubies. Laughter floated in the air as Mr. Harris entertained his guests, leaning back in his chair like a king among subjects. Every story he told was laced with numbers: how much a painting had cost, how many millions he had made in a single deal, how quickly he had outsmarted rivals. His guests chuckled politely, though many were tired of his endless boasting. Clara moved quietly between them, carrying trays, refilling glasses, clearing plates. She made no sound except for the gentle clink of porcelain against silver. Her face remained calm, her posture straight. But she noticed the way Mr. Harris's chest puffed more with every laugh he drew, as though the room existed only to reflect his greatness back to him. At one point, the conversation drifted toward international business. A guest asked about overseas markets, and another mentioned the challenges of language barriers. Mr. Harris smirked, waving his hand as if the problem were trivial. Languages? Bah. That's what I pay people for. Translators, assistants. Why waste my time when I can simply buy their skill? He leaned back, swirling his wine glass. Besides, people like me don't learn, we command. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances. The arrogance in his words was thick, but no one dared challenge him. That was when Mr. Harris's eyes landed on Clara, who was quietly placing a dish in front of a guest. A sly smile spread across his face. He loved moments like this, when he could show off not just his wealth, but his supposed superiority over those he employed. "Ah," he said loudly, pointing a finger toward her. "Perfect example." The room grew still. Clara froze for a second, lowering her eyes politely, unsure what he meant. Mr. Harris grinned, reaching into his jacket pocket. From it, he pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He laid it on the table dramatically, letting it sit there like a challenge waiting to be unveiled. "You see," he continued, his voice smooth with mockery, "this here is a passage in a foreign language, complex, intellectual. Something only educated men like myself deal with." He tapped the paper with his finger. "Now tell me, does anyone here think my maid could make sense of this?" A ripple of laughter rolled through the guests. Some chuckled nervously, unsure if they should join in. Clara stood silently, her hands folded in front of her, her face unreadable. Mr. Harris picked up the paper and waved it toward her. "Come here," he commanded. His voice carried across the long table like a whip. Slowly, Clara stepped forward, her eyes calm, though her heart thudded quietly in her chest. She took the paper with careful hands, glancing at the strange script printed across it. "Translate this," Mr. Harris said, his lips curling into a smirk. "Translate this, and my salary is yours." The room burst into laughter. Glasses clinked as guests leaned back in their chairs, amused at the ridiculousness of the challenge. A maid translating foreign text. Impossible. They expected her to stutter, to blush, to hand the paper back in defeat. That was the entertainment Mr. Harris wanted, the spectacle of proving how little she knew. Clara stood still, the paper in her hands, her eyes scanning the words. Her expression didn't change. She neither laughed nor frowned. She simply looked at the text with the focus of someone who wasn't intimidated. The laughter faded into whispers. Guests leaned closer, curious now. Why wasn't she panicking? Why wasn't she folding under the weight of the challenge? Mr. Harris leaned back in his chair, folding his arms with satisfaction. He was certain she would fail. He was certain this moment would cement his superiority, not only over her, but over everyone watching. "Go on then," he said mockingly. "Show us what you've got. Or are you as silent in knowledge as you are in speech?" Clara lifted her eyes briefly, meeting his gaze for the first time. There was no anger in her expression, no fear, only quiet steadiness, the kind that unsettled more than shouting ever could. The paper trembled slightly in her hands, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. She had been invisible for so long, overlooked, underestimated. But now she stood at the center of the grand room. All eyes fixed on her, the guests waited. The silence thickening. Mr. Harris smirked, tapping his fingers against his glass. Convinced the silence meant she was lost. But Clara knew something he didn't. She wasn't lost. She wasn't afraid. She carried knowledge inside her that no amount of wealth could buy. And tonight, the time had come for it to surface. She drew a slow, steady breath, her lips parting. The room leaned forward, waiting. And in that moment, before she even spoke a word, the balance of power had already begun to shift. The folded sheet of paper rested in Clara's hands, its edges crinkling softly under her steady fingers. The grand dining room, moments ago, full of laughter and clinking glasses, had fallen strangely quiet. Even the chandeliers above seemed to hum rather than shine. As if the entire house was waiting, Clara stood at the end of the long table. Her plain uniform and quiet posture in stark contrast to the glittering suits and gowns around her. Her eyes scanned the lines of foreign words, her expression calm, unreadable. She didn't rush, she didn't panic. She simply looked, as if weighing each character with care. The guests shifted in their seats. Some smirked, expecting failure. Others leaned closer, intrigued. The silence stretched so long, it began to feel heavy. Every second ticked by like an hour. Mr. Harris leaned back in his chair, one hand draped lazily over his wineglass, the other tapping his fingers against the polished wood of the table. His smirk widened with each passing second. To him, the silence meant victory. The maid was frozen, humiliated, exactly as he wanted. "Well," he said suddenly, his voice slicing through the stillness. "What's the matter? Cat, got your tongue." A few guests chuckled nervously, but the sound quickly died when Clara didn't respond. Her calm unsettled them. They expected wide eyes, trembling hands, a stuttered apology. Instead, she stood there like a statue, graceful and unbothered. The more they watched, the more the silence turned from amusing to unnerving. One man whispered to his neighbor, "Why isn't she saying anything?" The neighbor shrugged, his eyes never leaving her face. Maybe she can read it." The whisper traveled like a spark, igniting curiosity across the table. Could she? Surely not. She was just a maid. but her eyes focused, intent and looked like the eyes of someone lost. Mr. Harris caught the whispers and scoffed. He raised his voice so all could hear. "Don't fool yourselves. She doesn't know a word of it. She's probably pretending just to delay her embarrassment." He turned his gaze back to Clara, his smirk sharp. "Go on then. Give up. Admit it's beyond you. No shame in admitting your limits." Clara didn't flinch. She slowly folded the paper back into neat lines, holding it lightly in her hands as though she had all the time in the world. The silence grew heavier, pressing down on every person in the room. Even those who had laughed earlier now felt something. Different anticipation. The millionaire's smugness began to stretch thin. He cleared his throat, trying to fill the void she refused to break. "See," he said to his guests, chuckling. "This is why some people remain where they are. They don't have the tools, the knowledge. It's nothing to be ashamed of, really it's simply nature." The words floated through the room, bitter and cruel. A few guests frowned, discomfort flashing across their faces. They had seen arrogance in Harris before, but tonight his cruelty seemed sharper, uglier. They shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking between him and the quiet maid who still hadn't spoken. Clara finally lifted her gaze. She didn't look at the paper. She didn't look at the floor. She looked directly at Mr. Harris. Her eyes were steady, calm. But there was something inside them that made his smirk falter for the briefest moment. The guests noticed it too. A ripple of unease spread around the table. The silence was no longer awkward, it was electric, charged with something they couldn't name. It felt as though the entire room was standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for one small step that would send everything tumbling. A bead of sweat slid down Mr. Harris's temple, though he quickly wiped it away with a forced laugh. "Come now, don't keep us waiting all night," he said, his tone trying to mask the edge in his voice. "Do you plan to stand there in silence forever?" Still, Clara didn't rush. Her calmness was louder than any reply could have been. She held the silence like a weapon, letting it turn the room against him. The longer she waited, more foolish she began to look, mocking her while she stood steady and unshaken. One guest leaned forward, whispering under his breath, "She's not nervous. Look at her. She's waiting." Another nodded. "She's not defeated. She's planning." For the first time that night, the power in the room began to shift. Mr. Harris, though still seated at the head of the table, no longer looked untouchable. His laughter sounded forced, his arrogance thinner. Clara hadn't said a word, but already she was in control. The silence stretched one moment longer, then another. Guests held their breath. Forks rested untouched on plates. Glasses of wine sat forgotten in hands. Even the fire in the grand fireplace seemed to quiet its crackle. And then, just as Mr. Harris opened his mouth again, ready to throw another insult, Clara drew a breath. The air in the room shifted instantly. Every guest leaned closer. Waiting, the silence that had begun as humiliation was about to transform into something else entirely. Asterisk. Clara stood still at the end of the long dining table, the folded sheet of paper in her hands. The silence pressed harder, thick as smoke. All eyes were locked on her. Some were waiting for her to crumble, others for her to speak. Mr. Harris leaned back in his chair, smirking, convinced the silence proved his superiority. And then Clara's lips parted. The words that came out were smooth, clear, and steady. She spoke in a language none of the guests expected to hear from her, fluent, precise, flowing as naturally as water. The foreign text on the page transformed into meaning with every syllable she uttered. Gasps rippled through the room. A man dropped his fork onto his plate with a loud clink. A woman's hand froze halfway to her glass of wine. Everyone stared, their disbelief painted plainly across their faces. Clara continued without pause, her voice calm but firm. She read the entire passage effortlessly, translating not only the words but also the tone. The language was complex, the kind usually reserved for scholars and businessmen negotiating across borders, but to her, it was second nature. When she finished, the silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the silence of humiliation. This was the silence of shock. Mr. Harris's smirk had vanished. His wine glass trembled slightly in his hand, the liquid inside swirling dangerously close to the rim. He blinked at her as though he couldn't trust his own ears. For the first time that evening, the arrogance on his face cracked, replaced by disbelief. "You?" he stammered, his voice low, unsteady. "You can actually." "Yes," Clara said simply, folding the paper neatly and placing it back on the table. Her eyes met his, unwavering. "I can." The weight of her calm words was heavier than any shout. The guests, still wide-eyed, turned their gazes back and forth between her and the stunned millionaire. One man broke the silence. That was flawless. His voice carried awe. Another added, she translated every word perfectly. Mr. Harris's throat worked as he tried to swallow. His pride, so large just moments ago, felt small and fragile now. The words he had spoken earlier translate this, "And my salary is yours," hung in the air, mocking him. Clara did not remind him of his boast. She didn't need to. The room remembered for him. A woman at the table leaned forward, her eyes shining. "How many languages do you know?" she asked softly, almost as if speaking to someone far above her, not a maid. Clara's response was quiet but sure. "3, fluently. 2 more at a working level. I studied languages for years before. Life took me in another direction." Her honesty carried no bitterness, only dignity. She had spoken her truth without anger, without malice. And that made it even more powerful. The guests exchanged stunned looks. The maid, the woman they had all overlooked as part of the furniture of the mansion, had just revealed herself as more educated than many of them. Respect flickered in their eyes, replacing the casual dismissal they had carried only minutes before. Mr. Harris's hand clenched around the stem of his glass. His face flushed red, not from wine, but from humiliation. He searched for words, any words, to reclaim control. But nothing came. Every phrase he thought of collapsed before reaching his lips. Clara's calm gaze never wavered. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply stood with the quiet strength that had always lived inside her, finally visible to everyone in the room. The guests began to murmur, their whispers buzzing like bees. "Unbelievable. She's remarkable." All this time. Mr. Harris shifted in his seat, his chest rising and falling faster. He felt smaller now, exposed under the weight of their stares. The maid he had mocked so casually had undone his pride with nothing but her voice. One guest finally spoke directly to him. "Well, Harris, I believe she's earned your salary." The words were meant as a jest, but they cut sharper than any blade. Laughter, real laughter this time, rippled down the table, not at Clara, but at him. His humiliation was complete. Clara lowered her eyes respectfully, stepping back with grace, as though she hadn't just shaken the foundation of his pride. She didn't need applause. She didn't need reward. Her dignity was enough. The room, however, never see her the same way again. Mr. Harris sat stiffly in his chair, frozen, his face pale beneath the glow of the chandeliers. He had set the challenge to humiliate her. Instead, he had humiliated himself. And no amount of wealth could shield him from that truth. The guests would remember this moment for years to come. Not the fine wine, not the expensive dishes, but the night the maid's voice silenced a millionaire. And though Clara returned quietly to her duties, the air around her had changed. She was no longer invisible. She was unforgettable, Asterisk, the room still buzzed from Clara's flawless reply. The guests whispered in low voices, their eyes wide with admiration, some still shaking their heads as if trying to believe what they had just witnessed. The chandelier light glimmered over the long table, but all attention was fixed on the woman who stood quietly at its end. Mr. Harris sat stiff in his chair, frozen like a man struck by lightning. The smirk that had carried him all evening had vanished completely. His hand clung to his wineglass, but he didn't drink. He couldn't. His throat was too dry, his pride too shaken. One guest finally broke the silence. "Clara, how did you do that?" His voice carried awe, as though she had performed magic. Clara held the paper gently in her hand, folding it with calm precision before placing it neatly on the table. She didn't rush to answer. Her silence wasn't nervous, was thoughtful, measured. Finally, she lifted her eyes, her voice quiet but steady. "I studied languages when I was younger," she said softly. "My father was a schoolteacher. He believed knowledge was the one treasure no one could ever take away. He taught me to love words, to chase understanding in every form. By the time I was a teenager, I was fluent in 2 languages. By 20, I had studied 3 more. Gasps rippled through the room again. Guests exchanged glances of shock. This was not the life story they had imagined for a maid in a starched uniform, carrying trays through a millionaire's house. Clara continued. Her eyes focused not on the guests, but on the paper before her. "I wanted to become a teacher. I dreamed of standing before students, sharing knowledge the way my father once did for me. But life." She paused, drawing a steadying breath. "Life has a way of turning paths we don't expect. My father passed away. My family fell into hardship, and I had to provide. Education became a luxury I could no longer afford." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight heavier than gold. Guests leaned forward, hanging on to every syllable. "I worked where I could," she went on, her voice still calm. "Cleaning houses, serving tables, taking whatever jobs kept food on the table. But I never let go of what I had learned. In the quiet hours, I read. I practiced. I whispered foreign words to myself so I wouldn't lose them. My uniform may have changed, but knowledge remained my companion." The room fell into a deeper silence. This wasn't just translation any. It was truth. It was dignity revealed in its purest form. Clara lifted her gaze and looked straight at Mr. Harris. Her eyes weren't angry. They weren't bitter. They were steady, calm, and unshaken. "So when you handed me that page, sir," she said, her tone respectful but firm, "you assumed I was less. You assumed I was silent because I had nothing to say. But silence does not mean ignorance, and uniform does not define intelligence." The words struck harder than any blow. Mr. Harris's face turned red, then pale, as though the air had been sucked out of him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The guests, however, murmured among themselves, their voices carrying admiration for Clara and judgment for him. One guest whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "She has more dignity than all his money combined." Another nodded. "And more wisdom." Clara did not smile. She didn't need to. She wasn't here to humiliate him. His own arrogance had done that. She had simply revealed the truth, and the truth was powerful enough on its own. A woman near the middle of the table raised her glass slightly, her eyes shining. "To Clara," she said softly. At first, it seemed too bold, too strange, but then another guest lifted his glass, then another. Soon the table was filled with raised glasses, their crystal clinking together in an unspoken toast to the maid who had stood taller than the millionaire. Mr. Harris did not raise his. He sat rigid, humiliated, staring at the tablecloth as though it could swallow him whole. Clara bowed her head humbly. "Thank you," she whispered, then turned to leave the spotlight she had never asked for. She stepped back, her posture as graceful as it had been all evening, returning to her quiet place in the background. But the room no longer saw her as invisible. She had become unforgettable. The truth had been revealed, and it could not be hidden again. The dinner that had begun with laughter and boasting now sat under a heavy stillness. The clinking of glasses, the chatter of deals and wealth, all of it had vanished. The air was different, thick with a truth that could not be ignored. The chandeliers still shone, but their glow seemed softer, as if even the light was embarrassed by Mr. Harris's arrogance. He sat at the head of the table, silent, his jaw tight. The smirk that had been glued to his face all evening was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar to him: shame. His hand hovered near his wine glass, but he couldn't bring himself to drink. His guest had toasted the maid, not him. Their admiration had shifted, and with it, the balance of the room had changed forever. Clara had returned to her quiet place at the edge of the room. She did not gloat. She did not smirk back. She carried herself with the same dignity she always had, head high, shoulders straight, her presence calm and unshaken. That quiet strength made Mr. Harris's pride crumble even more. For the first time, he saw her not as the maid, but as a human being with depth, intelligence, and grace he had never imagined. The truth of his own blindness stung worse than the humiliation. He realized he had mocked someone far greater than he understood, and in doing so, he had mocked himself. One guest broke the silence, his tone gentle but pointed. "Harris, you always speak of wealth as though it is everything. But tonight?" Wealth looked very small. Another added softly, "Respect costs nothing. And yet it seems to be the one thing you cannot afford." The words cut deeper than Clara's translation had. They came not from her, but from his peers, the very people whose approval he thrived on. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his pride wounded beyond repair. Clara, however, remained silent. Her silence now was not the silence of invisibility. It was the silence of victory, the kind that didn't need noise to be heard. Everyone in the room understood it. Mr. Harris finally cleared his throat, his voice rough. "Clara," he said, unable to meet her eyes. The name, spoken aloud, was the first sign of respect he had ever shown her. "I underestimated you." Clara inclined her head politely, her expression calm. "You judged me, sir," she corrected gently, but without anger. And judgment without understanding always leads to blindness. The words struck like lightning. Harris lowered his gaze, the truth undeniable. For years, he had built his life on pride, on the belief that money made him untouchable. But tonight, one woman in a maid's uniform had undone all of it with nothing more than knowledge and dignity. The guests began to rise, the dinner drawing to a quiet end. They shook Clara's hand, offered her kind words, and cast lingering looks at Harris, their judgment clear. This night would follow him long after the plates were cleared. His reputation as a man of power had cracked, replaced with the image of a proud millionaire silenced by his own maid. Clara slipped away to the kitchen, her duties continuing as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But every guest who left the mansion knew the truth. She had changed the story of the evening forever. They would tell it to others, not as gossip, but as a lesson. Wealth could buy chandeliers, cars, and wine worth thousands. But it could not buy respect. And it could not silence truth. For Mr. Harris, the lesson was carved deeply into his pride. He would remember the way his words translate this, and "my salary is yours" had turned to dust in his mouth. He would remember how the room's admiration had shifted away from him, how laughter had turned into silence, how his arrogance had been stripped bare in front of those he sought to impress. And for Clara, life went on as it always had. She did not ask for applause, nor did she expect rewards. Her strength was not in seeking attention, but in living with quiet dignity. She had no need to prove herself to anyone. But when the moment had come, she had spoken and the world had listened. The story of that night traveled far beyond the mansion's walls. It became a tale whispered in business circles, told at dinner parties, shared as a reminder. Some told it as a caution. Never humiliate those who serve you, for they may be greater than you think. Others told it as an inspiration. Strength comes in many forms. And dignity is the sharpest weapon of all. And though the millionaire's pride never fully recovered, the lesson remained etched in the memory of everyone present. Never judge a person by their job, their clothes, or their silence. For sometimes, the quietest voices carry the greatest truths.